Welcome to the SprocketPod, your podcast for helpful HubSpot content. I'm Cameron Collins, and alongside my co-host Mark Lerner, we sit down each week with experts on the HubSpot CRM to break down cool builds and unique apps that will make your instance better. Whether you're a new admin or you're a business owner looking to get the most out of HubSpot, our conversations are going to provide you with unique insights that you can apply. Don't forget, we host the SprocketPod live on LinkedIn every week, and you can catch all of our episodes on YouTube and Spotify. Let's dive into today's episode and get you working smarter with HubSpot. Hello, and welcome to the SprocketPod. 40 episodes in, and we have an official intro bump. That's
Wow,
exciting.
40 episodes.
40
Not too
episodes. For
shabby.
those of you who don't know, Mark and I, we do this every week. And as a revenue operations strategist, we get to interview so many amazing people. And this week we've got Lizzie on. Lizzie, welcome.
Thank you guys. Really excited to be here. As Cameron said, my name is Lizzie. I am a fellow revenue operations strategist at RevPartners. And for those that don't know me, I may look somewhat familiar from the RevOps Girl Walk series on LinkedIn.
And Lizzie is an absolute masterclass just when it comes to revenue operations, doing some really cool things in HubSpot. And something that's become a bit of a recurring theme of this show is not just how to build cool stuff in HubSpot, but how being better as a business person and as a revenue operations professional that helps to enable you as an expert in the HubSpot CRM. So today we're going to be talking about data maturity, what it is and why it's important. But really, just to set the stage, the episode today is going to be breaking down a framework for how you think about your data. And this isn't necessarily something that Lizzie or myself came up with, but Lizzie, I want to kick it over to you and just talk a little bit about what it means to look at the business from a data maturity model.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. So as you called out, getting in a CRM, trying to execute on so many different work streams can be really exciting, but you need to be starting with a solid foundation. And I think so many businesses get so blinded by the shiny new tool they want to implement or wanting to move too quickly that they don't stop to think, hey, where are we really at from a foundational maturity perspective? And what is our realistic next step? Because you can't just go from level 0 to level 5 overnight. It needs to be a steady climb if you want to do it right.
I think that it helps us to answer the question of not just can we build something, but should we build it or should we use that app? We were talking offline about the usage of all different kinds of apps and whether it's a CPQ tool or otherwise. And for example, if you have a very early CRM, like you just purchased HubSpot, you probably shouldn't be jumping in and looking at all the different apps that you can set up. There's going to be much more fundamental or foundational things that you can look at. So we'll talk about when it is time to use those apps, but to set the stage for data maturity, this model that Lizzie and I use, it involves really four levels of data maturity. And essentially what we're talking about today is the progression of the data in your HubSpot CRM from can I answer a basic question, which is, am I going to hit my revenue goals? Up through, can I accurately and reliably report on anything and everything that I need to? And so when we think about just that first level one basic foundation, what are some of the things that indicate that maybe a HubSpot instance is very early, very basic data maturity?
For me, it starts all with the data integrations. So you can't start to do anything unless you've actually got all of your data collected in a central place. So you can start to strategize on what that next step is going to look like. So from a level 1 or sometimes even level 0 maturity standpoint, it's all about getting all the systems connected, making sure everyone's getting to know each other in the pot, and starting to define a process around each of those systems. It's really how I look at it.
Interesting thing about we talk about level one, but to your point, some may say there's a level zero, which is I have a literally brand new instance and there's nothing in it. So you have no data in HubSpot, and maybe you have to set up very basic integrations. But when it comes to level one, really what we're trying to understand is a very basic question, which is do I have my data in my CRM? So we're not even really looking at can we answer any of our goals or can we hit our sales targets, but it's just, do I have everything connected so I can even start to look at data in HubSpot? And for
And
a
I
lot
think
of companies, that's a struggle.
And I think I'd call out this is probably the most discouraging stage, or may feel like it because it can feel slow moving. You're not necessarily seeing the output of all of the inputs that you now have. So it can definitely be one of the stages that, yeah, feels slowest moving, but is arguably the most important.
And I know, even for example, Mark, I know you talk to a lot of different companies in different spheres and business professionals. And so when it comes to things that make for business professionals who can really start to get an eye for data, what are some of, maybe, I know we've talked about resources here on the episode, but what are some resources that you think people can tie into to help people just start to get a sense for core business skills or data skills or HubSpot skills or whatever it may be?
Yeah, obviously, I think we've talked about where my experience with um, the kind of more structured education, but those resources are obviously really super helpful for most people. I know that you all have some really interesting internal stuff that you use. I don't know if you expose them externally about data modeling, but I like to think about these things in terms of the context of each company, right? So I don't know if there's a one size fits all. So if I'm in a RevOps role, maybe a new RevOps role, I'm going to the different kind of stakeholders and understanding the go-to-market process and how they view things and think of things in terms of like objects and items and how everything works together. That's usually my go-to.
I think one thing that you called out there, Mark, is it's not a one size fits all model. So level 0, level 1 maturity could look, or really any level could look wildly different depending on the business. If you're someone getting started in HubSpot and you only have one other tool that you need to connect that's gathering customer data, you're probably going to move to level 2 really fast. Whereas if you're a really mature company with a bunch of disparate systems and data everywhere, it could take you 6 months, a year to potentially get to that next step.
Mhm. Do you guys, when you break down your data maturity model, how do you define when somebody has gone from that foundational initial stage to stage two, whether it's growth and optimization or whatever the kind of naming convention is? Are there waypoints that they pass where you say, okay, now we've moved on?
I think, Cameron, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I would say level 1 to 2 is probably the easiest cutoff point to be able to identify, because in level 1, to get to level 2, we're trying to understand, can we answer the question, are we going to hit our revenue goals? So do we have the data and the simple reports in place to understand if we are moving towards that North Star metric?
Yeah, and there isn't necessarily a hard and fast line that says this business is 1 or this business is 2 or this business is 3, but there are specific key indicators that say, oh, this is a relatively earlier stage business. And so the really four key waypoints, if you will. Number one is, can we trust the data in our CRM? Whereas then we get to level two, and there's four total levels that we'll be talking about today. But level two is going to be, can we speak to our primary KPIs? So, do we know what our MQL metrics are? Do we know what our SQL metrics are? Do we know what our sales revenue is? Right? So we start looking at our primary KPIs. And then with level three, we start to get into secondary KPIs. So what are the drivers of the MQLs, the SQLs, the revenue? How can we break that down? And then level four, which is the holy grail of revenue operations and is relatively far and few between because it just takes so long to build toward, is going to be having your full financial suite integrated with HubSpot. Just being able to get more complex with the inputs and outputs of all of your data, not just necessarily your sales metrics.
Yeah, I think the way we think about it is on that third stage, you're then able to activate your data, you're able to do things with it, you're able to make data-driven decisions. And I think that from Deal Hub perspective, that's usually the sweet spot where a tool like a CPQ becomes invaluable. I think up until that point, when we're talking to people that are not quite there in their data maturity, we having that as your North Star in preparation to get to that stage. But once you hit that stage where you're able to convert that data into insights and you're actually able to reliably do stuff with that, that's where we really are able to provide a lot more value. And I think it's probably like that with many tools. I suffer from the shiny object syndrome. So if I setting up a new instance of anything, I'm looking at plugins and integrations before I'm even thinking about process, and that's a mistake. And I always have to pull myself back.
Not to say that that's not allowed, but you're just not going to be able to use it to its highest capacity until you've got that data in a good spot. And I see a lot of people rule out otherwise really good tools because they implemented it too prematurely.
And that's, I think, a difficulty for companies is slowing down and understanding that having more tools doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because it is quite frequent where you might have an early stage company, and I say early stage from a data maturity perspective. They're first integrating with HubSpot and they want to get their CPQ set up and they're like, let's get a tool, let's get a plugin. And oftentimes, as the HubSpot admin and the strategist, we have to slow them down and say, you don't have life cycle stages set up. Why don't we start there and do that first? I want to kick it over to you, Lizzie, because I know that there are some epics or projects that typically help companies to shift and get their data really aligned and get through levels 1 and 2 and 3 and such. So, what are some of the things that we look at to help align that level 1 maturity and to align that level 1 data and level them up?
Thank you. Thank you for that, Cameron. So yeah, I'd say from a level one perspective, like aside from core data integrations, one of the first things that you want to look at getting set up in HubSpot or any CRM is going to be lifecycle stage tracking, which you already called out, which is defining the customer journey. So taking the time to offline map what that customer journey is from session to education to acquisition to post sales so that we can set up the right triggers in the system to be able to track that customer from stage to stage. That allows you to understand the conversion rates between stages so you can start to identify those bottlenecks, get into those secondary KPIs and understand why are we not moving more from MQL to SQL or SQL to opportunity. Another one that really stands out to me would be sales stages. So getting a clear process in place for your sales team, getting those pipelines set up, making sure you're not skipping stages in your pipeline, just to call out. And yeah, making sure that process is in place. The team is feeling good with the pipelines. Session tracking is probably another one that I think would be pretty foundational. Cameron, I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I think that you called out two of the largest ones because even something like lead scoring, forecasting, and sales goals, right? That's something that a lot of companies they might come to us and open a conversation and say, "Hey, I really want to set up goals so I can track my sales reps." But then we look at their sales stages, and you have reps that are skipping stages, and it just causes problems. And so the reality is that unless there is a legitimate reason for stages to be skipped where you just don't care about conversion metrics, in which case this probably is not the best conversation for you. That's like a very fundamental thing, right? And so setting that up is not a native feature in HubSpot. It is now for some packages. So I actually take that back where you can prevent sales stages to be skipped. If you have stages that are being skipped, and for example, you don't have the right required properties in place and you just don't have your data aligned, then it just causes a trickle down effect of problems. And I know now there are deal rules, so we can more easily turn that on with sales stages. And I believe the same thing is coming up for life cycle stages in the pipeline to more easily prevent those from being skipped. But same thing applies. A lot of companies have default life cycle stages turned on, and you have somebody that is created as a lead, and then they become an opportunity, and then they become a customer, and then nobody knows what evangelist really means, so nobody's looking at that stage. And in reality, what you ought to do is create inclusion lists and triggers and workflows and use all of that to move contacts systematically through stages. So I think that it requires being intentional about those two big ones.
I assume you guys have a similar experience when you bring on a new customer, but I know that for an implementation when we do one, it really lays bare where the blind spots are in terms of data and process and everything. There, people may come into an implementation only seeing one aspect of things, and then when you really have to kind of dig deep into all the different pieces, it becomes clearer when the data maturity isn't really there yet, or there's blind spots in the process. That all comes out in the bright light of an implementation.
It really does. And I feel like a lot of that is identified during the mapping process, which is really integral to, I think, reiterating what I've already said, but understanding what that entry point for that lead or that individual is up until the point where they become a customer and continue to renew and expand. You need to understand all of the tools that are touched, all of the data that's collected, all of the processes in place, even before you begin with those core integrations, setting up the foundation. You need to have that mapping in a good spot and then continue to build on that when you make these enhancements so that you've got a source of truth from outside looking in.
And there's no definitive timeline for how long it takes to go through stage one, two, three, four. Of course, can vary based on any number of factors, but it's not unreasonable that you can be sitting in maturity level one for 6 to 12 months. And that is working very hard and very intentionally to get your data aligned. And the reason for that is because we've talked about sales stages, we've talked about life cycle stages, but when we start to look at even more complex aspects that play into some of the latter stages, say marketing attribution, that relies on just setting the foundation for a lot of very fundamental things early on. You don't wake up in 18 months and then just do full marketing attribution with having no forethought prior. Oftentimes you're doing little things along the way that play into that. So level one is really answering into the, do we trust the data coming into our CRM? Then level two is where we start to actually look at the data and analyze. And this is where you start to shift what I think is more of a spectrum as you go from HubSpot admin toward revenue operations professional, where you can start to look at and analyze data. And so, with stage two being more focused on the KPIs, what are some of the things, Lizzie, that tie into being able to track and measure those KPIs?
First thing that comes to mind for me would be lead scoring as an epic that or a project that the door becomes open around stage two, where you've got all of the insights and all the data that you're collecting on your leads, their ICP attributes, so their fit or their behavior scores, and you can start to understand who are your most qualified individuals, who are your least qualified individuals, and help raise those up to your sales team. So you can start to, Cameron, like as you've said, understand and make inferences from the data to help increase performance or improve performance downstream.
I know something that definitely goes hand in hand with lead scoring is forecasting and sales goals. If level one is speaking into, is our data in HubSpot? Level two is, do we have anything that we're aiming towards? And you may be using the native sales goals feature in HubSpot. You may be using a workaround with reporting. But the key is that if you are using spreadsheets to track sales numbers, then you are much earlier in the maturity of the data in your CRM than you probably realize. Because I know, speaking for myself, my goal is to get the sales executives out of spreadsheets so that they're using HubSpot natively for, okay, what are the sales goals? What are the sales metrics? Are we using forecasting in HubSpot? And at a very high level, can we do that natively and easily? And if they can do that, then to me, that's a win. And it's a signal that we've at least achieved maturity level two.
And I
When we
think
start
it,
to get, oh, go for it.
oh, I was just going to say, I think also considering like ensuring that you can track all of your acquisition and like your left side of the bow tie KPIs, your session to lead to MQL to SQL conversion rates, those are really integral and can help you understand, am I really at maturity level two?
And For anyone who might be tuning in and wondering what the heck is a bow tie, we've done entire episodes on breaking down bow tie models, breaking it down with revenue architecture and winning by design. And so we've gotten into that pretty extensively on the show. But effectively, yeah, that is going to be your lead acquisition, all of those steps up through the deal going to closed one. Because as we start to get to levels 3 and then 4, that's where we start to look at again those secondary KPIs and then also that right side of the bow tie. So we've talked about the ways to grow and scale a company on this show, and oftentimes the focus ought to not be on net new revenue and closing net new customers and net new logos, but expansion and growing the influence with the customers you have. So with that in mind, though, level 3 does have a bit of a focus on secondary KPIs. What are some of the things, Lizzie, that you've looked at with your partners where secondary KPIs come into play across breaking down metrics?
First thing that really comes to mind for me is like better understanding the lead acquisition channels so that or marketing attribution so that we know of the individuals that we are getting into the system, where are they coming from? How are they learning about us? And we can have more insightful insights to action off of.
And I know, yeah, lead acquisition channel is a huge one when it comes to secondary KPIs. That it can even just be granular where you want to know the geography of the people who are purchasing your service, really anything. This is where you aren't just understanding are we achieving our goals, but why are we achieving them? Or why did we miss them? Is it because in Q1 we had this particular segment of customers that contributed to most of our revenue and we nailed our goal, but then maybe in Q2 that segment dropped off and the rest of everything else was equal, so now we have to figure out how to get that segment back up. And so understanding what those levers are that are contributing to your goals, that's where if you can answer that and speak into why you're achieving your goal, you're definitely a solid maturity level 3. And this is where if we start to look at those apps and those tools, they can start to become more useful as they help you to streamline your processes or get better data quality. So whether we're looking at a tool like Deal Hub for CPQ or something somewhere else in the process, I definitely think maturity level 1 is very early to be thinking about it. Maturity levels 2, 3, 4, that's where those really start to come into play.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure that the maturity model format that you use is, I think they're pretty much aligned, but the way we see it when it becomes a tool like Deal Hub becomes very valuable is again probably level 3. I think we call it the activation stage, where you're able to make data-driven decisions based on the KPIs that you've set and that they're reliable, and you're actually able to do stuff with it. That's generally the maturity level where it becomes valuable. I think earlier than that, often you get into a situation where you're in onboarding, you're in implementation, and all sorts of things that hadn't really been considered or haven't been decided yet have to get decided before implementation can happen. And doing that under the gun of an implementation is probably not the best way to get it done.
Would you say that implementations that come further in a business's maturity are more successful and probably stick around longer?
First of all, I think that obviously I'm biased, but when I talk to our customers, which I do often, the thing they're most glowing about is the onboarding, implementation, and ongoing support. So we have very patient and insightful folks doing it. So I think regardless of the situation, it gets done. But I don't know, because taking a step back from just the use case of Deal Hub, but let's speak more generally about implementation and the maturity of a company. There's a lot of factors, right? I was talking to someone I met at an event the other week, and he had said that they were 2 years into an implementation of a very well-known enterprise tool in the, let's say, quote to cash space, that's pretty wild. But it basically came down to the kind of lead internal hero or internal stakeholder who made the decision to move forward with this tool, left halfway. Things change. So much changes in those times. So there's so many factors that go into it that can have an impact.
I entirely agree. And I feel like a lot of times when those implementations are starting in earlier level maturities, it comes from more of a want and not a need place because you don't have the data to back it. And so, just my personal opinion and my experience, I feel like they fail when they are starting in those earlier stages, but it is very case by case dependent.
Yeah.
And I think to that point, I've mentioned what I believe is a spectrum. I don't think that being in our space, at least, you're necessarily ever not going to be in some capacity a HubSpot admin. But if you have no data in your HubSpot CRM, you can't do revenue operations. If you have data you don't trust, you can't reliably do revenue operations. And so I think that when we talk about this data maturity model, it's the lens of reliability and the amount of effectively revenue operations that you're able to conduct within HubSpot. And so I think that's why it's so important that as a HubSpot admin, it's important that everyone become versed to some degree in RevOps, because if you're just sitting here building things, then you don't necessarily have this framework to work toward, and you're not going to build better data maturity, and you're not going to be able to make data driven decisions. And I'm curious, because I know that we've all experienced it, but if either of you can affirm having been asked by maybe an executive, hey, can you build that report, or can you build this workflow or work on this project, and maybe you had to push back because it was a little early in the process.
Happens to me all the time.
Yeah. I don't think I could speak to direct experience with that because I'm not really involved in the implementation. And I don't know. Generally, right, somebody who's coming to Deal Hub is by definition almost always beyond stage one, let's say. If they're already thinking about a tool like a CPQ, it's likely that they're beyond that. It's usually somebody who's been working out of a Google sheet to handle their pricing and pricing calculators and templates in Gmail and Word docs, and you know, and they've usually hit a level of pain with that that necessitates. So I don't think necessarily it often happens that there's that kind of thing.
I find myself having to pump the brakes a lot with some of the partners that I work with, and it can feel discouraging at times when you're like, hey, I can't reliably pull that report, but I would much rather tell someone we don't have the data to make a decision there than give them the wrong data and make the wrong decision.
Yeah, and I hope my people are listening to this, my partners that I work with, but this is a message to everybody as well. Maybe a hot take, but I think that it is incumbent upon us to get a list of every spreadsheet that the executives
Mm.
that we're talking to are using, and systematically work through how we can, I say, kill the spreadsheet. It's just at some point, right, the goal would be you're doing everything in HubSpot. And maybe it's not all native. Perhaps you're using a tool like Deal Hub and other tools and apps that play into it. But ideally, you want to be doing everything in HubSpot. And it will blow my mind where I could be working with someone for 12 months and they're like, hey, I'm using this spreadsheet for something I thought we did 6 months back. And they just never even told me that sheet existed. And it's incumbent upon me to be asking for that list, but I think that as a RevOps pro, as someone who's in HubSpot, it's important for us to get that list of those spreadsheets so that at the beginning of an engagement or as early as possible, we can reference back to it and start killing them off one by one.
That's such a good call out, Cameron. And funnily enough, a situation I found myself in this week being time for quarterly business reviews. And I think that's a question that you need to ask not only at the beginning, but just at every stage, because as you mature, people have different questions that they want to answer. They have their own sources that they're probably going to go look to. So it's just encouraging HubSpot as that single source of truth.
And so we've talked about this in terms of a framework, right? You've got maturity levels one, two, three, four. Level one speaks into, do we have our data in HubSpot? Do we trust it? Is it all connected? Level two is, do we have um, basic, primary, high level KPIs in HubSpot? Our sales goals, our MQL metrics. Level 3 is, can we break that down and partition the data and start to understand whether we're going to achieve those goals and why? Then we've got level 4, and this is, I mentioned earlier, the holy grail of RevOps. But Lizzie, I'd like you to go ahead and speak into level 4 a little bit for what does this look like for a business?
Yeah, so when we reach maturity level 4, which I'll call out is not as common as we'd probably all like to see it, just because it's really difficult and it takes a lot of energy and time and iterations at previous stages. But when you reach there, you're really able to have all of your financial information integrated and you have a clear vision of the entire business funnel. All of the operations, the go-to-market operations are connected and flowing well. And it's like the aha moment for a lot of businesses.
And there's two, I think, key things you mentioned there, but one is net revenue retention,
Mm.
which active recurring revenue balance. We can call it any number of things, but I certainly have a lot of opinions and thoughts on why it's so difficult to achieve. But what are some of the things that play into maybe the difficulty of seeing this in HubSpot? I'm
From
curious,
a
Lizzie or Mark, if both of you have a perspective on this.
Yeah, I think, and I've read definitionally about what NRR is to different people. I've heard people gross revenue retention, gross revenue retention, net revenue retention, net dollar retention, gross dollar retention. There's like the differences between these I found to be funky. When I think of NRR, it's essentially telling me how much my existing customer base is growing, or the revenue I have from my existing customers is growing. Ideally, you want to have above 100% NRR means that the value you're getting from your existing customer base is increasing, and below it means it's decreasing. Meaning you have to increase the amount of customers you have just that much just to break even. But I think because it's flimsy definition, maybe that's part of the reason it's so difficult to get a calculation, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think that is definitely, I agree. I agree that every business looks at that through a different lens, which can make it really difficult to standardize across the board. And on top of that, HubSpot HubSpot doesn't have a great native solution to track NRR. However, RevPartners did recently solve for that project, so that was really exciting to see. But it is tough because you've got a lot of finance data coming from sometimes different sources, and finding a way to cleanly organize that and then run all of the necessary calculations in a single system and visualize it. That's not a simple feat.
And this
Mhm.
is where I think when we think about level 4 and talk about net revenue retention, it puts into perspective how maybe something that's seemingly small can snowball into this big problem that you can't solve. Because if the goal is to know the active recurring revenue balance at any given time and whether it's growing or shrinking, there's a few key things you need to know. What is the recurring amount on a monthly basis? What is the contract start date and end date? What is the term length? And let's just say, for example, you're doing your quoting and your CPQ process in an external tool. You go into HubSpot, you put in a deal amount, and you move a deal to closed one. Now, if you don't have your contract start date, your term length, you can't know by definition what that active revenue balance is because we just know, oh, we have $1,000 and we closed it on this date. And so it snowballs into this issue where now we have to use native deal line items. That's the easy route, or a custom object. That's the tough route, but still oftentimes is done. And again, like just those few data points that then play into net revenue retention, if you don't have that, you're toast. And that's just the beginning of the conversation. Before you're even talking about contract start date and end date, we have to backtrack and set up sales stages, set up life
Mm.
cycle stages. Are we tracking sessions in HubSpot? And again, it's that foundation that you lay for the first 12 months just trying to make HubSpot sensible that leads you then to be able to start to get to these more complex and fun things, I think.
And from that NRR perspective, I think you also really need to consider what your what is it? Your gosh, I'm sorry, drawing a blank. Whether you're doing like a subscription or really one-time purchases. So what that recurring or non-recurring payment structure looks like.
That's a good point too, because if you have a one-time payment, how does that factor in, right?
Mhm.
A non-recurring payment.
Or
Um,
an
how do you
adjustment.
factor that into net revenue retention, right? And so, again, are you using native deal line items? Are you using a third-party tool? Either way, do you have that balance? And then do you have the historical? So, if, for example, you implement this process today and going forward, if I have deals that I set up 6 months ago, 12 months ago, and I don't have their contract start date, their contract end date, their term length, how am I going to actually get my net revenue retention balance for today? And the answer is you really can't, not without doing a lot of backtracking and things that can be done, but it's not an overnight process. Overall, level four, net revenue retention, active recurring balance, that's half the equation. And then the other half is your overall finance. So we've talked a little bit offline about having your really financial suite in HubSpot. And I know that this is not done for most companies, that everything is interconnected, but I think it would be super cool where a company does have expenses, or you've got your ad spend just being one example, but right, like all of your expenses tied into HubSpot through custom objects. And now you can track really your full financial data model end to end in HubSpot.
100%. It just goes back to creating that single source of truth where anyone in the company could go and look and at least at a high level understand what that performance looks like. We're not saying you need to move all of your revenue recognition and everything over to HubSpot immediately, but just having the ability to connect all of those dots within a single portal, that's the name of the game.
I would be curious for anyone who's listening on LinkedIn, who's listening on one of our recordings, to drop a comment with what maturity level maybe you think your business model is. Because again, level one is going to be, is all of my data connected? Is everything coming into HubSpot? Level two is, do I have my primary KPIs in HubSpot, my sales goals, my MQLs, my close one ratio, right? Do I have all those core KPIs being measured? Level three is going to be, can you partition that? So, can you break it down and understand why you're achieving your sales goals? And then level four is your full data model. Can you track net revenue retention? Do you have your payment operations in HubSpot? I'm curious what some of our listeners may be experiencing in their businesses. But, Lizzie, what is some of the stuff that you've experienced when it comes to working with your partners and helping them to understand as executives, yes, we might need to pump the brakes, but so we can improve your data maturity. What are some of those experience or conversations when it comes to helping people get through levels one, two, three, four?
Yeah, I think it's really important to help individuals or executives visualize the need as opposed to just explaining it to them. So circling back to what it's so important to have a clear mapping of what the current state is and what your ideal end state is going to be so that you can highlight what areas are in red, what areas are in yellow. We're making improvements, but it's not perfect. And then what do we actually have in the green? So I try to rely on visualizations and just keeping it real because if you try to say that you're at a higher maturity level than you really are, if you try to turn a blind eye to data, sure, it may help you in your current moment, maybe, but you are going to be asking for forgiveness 6 months down the road. So just accepting what the current state is and doing what you have to do to get to the next step.
Just found it compelling where we have, obviously there's publicly traded companies and they share their earnings reports, and I think that's probably something for all of us in that kind of RevOps space to be striving toward, where you can deliver a QBR and know that my data is so tight that it actually has an impact. And keep in mind, it's not our job necessarily to make a sales rep better at their job and sell more money. But if we can highlight and enable the whole team by pointing out what's working well and what isn't, and then by being the HubSpot admin just facilitating that, then that's ultimately a win for everybody.
Yeah, think about it from the perspective of, let's say, companies in the tech startup space, and maybe not only that. The kind of ultimate growth goal of those companies is either an IPO or an exit. And to do either of those things, you have to have your data in order. You're not going to pass the SEC's their analysis You're not going to get acquired by a company unless they can truly understand how much revenue is recognized and all of this information. And that requires, really good data maturity. And as someone in RevOps, that's like your North Star. It's obviously like the promised land for everybody, but you have to be prepared for it, and you have to be the one that's preparing your company for it.
I'm curious from both of you because Mark, you talked about go-to-market motions earlier, and I've seen so much talk about the term is overused and people are just like everything is go-to-market nowadays. What's your hot take on is it just simply inbound, outbound, maybe a one or two step motion and enterprise, or are you seeing that it's overused and abused nowadays?
The term go to market motion?
Yeah, just everyone being a go-to-market expert in this and everything is go-to-market
Yeah,
that and
I'll be honest. Let's say maybe 3 or 4 years ago was the first time I'd even heard this term, and I don't know what that says about me, but maybe that was when it emerged. I'm not sure. I had no idea what they were talking about. I'd gotten along just fine the 10 years previous talking about things like marketing, customer success, and sales. But my understanding, and I think in this world that we now live in, which RevOps plays a key role, where those three organizations and maybe a few others are increasingly less separate from each other, especially in a world where net revenue retention is a key metric. So customer success is focused on not only they're getting those NPS scores up, but also upselling, cross-selling, and expanding. It's a useful term, right? Yeah, I don't know. I don't have much of a hot take, to be honest, today.
that go for it, Lizzie.
I was going to maybe challenge, not challenge, but I do agree that it is one of those terms that was born overnight and then just used to reference just about anything. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing because I like that people are starting to think as sales and marketing and customer success all under the same umbrella as opposed to siloed departments.
The truth is, though, and maybe this is just a lack of visibility. I hear it, we talk about it a lot. It's rare that I've seen on the inside of a company where it's truly a thing, where it's truly those departments are, there's no silo, right? They are a singular motion. Everybody's striving towards lower friction between them, greater visibility. Even in companies where there's a CRO that ostensibly sits above those departments, I haven't, I don't know, maybe you have. It doesn't seem like there's anyone I've seen that does it really well.
I think that suppose if we look at the definition, product-led sales, you've got outbound sales, you've got enterprise sales, and outbound can be broken down. Product-led being marketing driven, the rest being more sales driven approach. I think that go to market in and of itself is a useful term. I do think that looking at LinkedIn, especially, and maybe it's the bubble that I'm in, you do have a lot of people that it's just like go to market expert. And so what does that mean? Whereas I think that if you are thinking more so of this is a component of my business, then it is a very useful thing because you do want to be able to look at a company and understand should this be a product led motion or should this be an enterprise type of approach to how you're selling because maybe the way that you're trying to sell to your customers isn't necessarily the best approach and obviously understanding the fundamentals of how go to market motions work is important to being able to do that, but I think that just this notion of I'm an expert in go to market, I would
Yeah,
challenge
that's
somebody to come out and tell us what that really means.
yeah, yeah. I think that might be potentially an influencer term that somebody worked in marketing and wants to relate to a broader audience, and so they become a go-to-market expert.
I think that especially when we tie this all just back into data maturity models, and I opened with how are some ways that people can, really get a grasp of where their business stands. And I think that, in my opinion, it starts from just getting a stronger understanding of revenue operations. On YouTube, you can go and find RevOps Summer School is a great, it's like a 6 hour course. There's HubSpot certs that play into it now. There's HubSpot boot camps that play into it. And then also even just connecting with people like the three of us on LinkedIn and people in our sphere is a huge way to um, really just educate yourself on the different aspects and components of RevOps. And Lizzie, I know you do your RevOps girl walks. So I'd love to get into it a little bit, just the inspiration behind how RevOps girl walks came to be and some of the things that you talk about in the episodes that you do through that.
Yeah. So RevOps Girl Walks, it's a series that I kicked off alongside Cassie, I believe Moreno, I believe is how we're going to say her last name. I may be butchering that. Sorry, Cassie. But she's our content and creator manager here at RevPartners. And so this was an opportunity for us to take our thought leadership in the space as women in RevOps, which can be intimidating, knowing that it is a field dominated by male influence. Numbers could be scary. So trying to share a lot of the foundational and like thought leadership and just key concepts that drive our strategy day to day in a way that is digestible and not intimidating. So a quick 1 minute walk with your coffee, talking about something like net revenue retention, or maybe I think my most recent episode was about auditing your tech stack and making sure that you don't have any phantom energy tools drawing resources and money that aren't providing an ROI. So lots of great stuff out there. Highly recommend taking a peek at myself or Cassie, and it's actually exploding. We've got a lot of other people out there doing RevOps Girl Walk. So it's not something that's gate kept to girls. Anyone can be a RevOps girl.
I support this fully. Mark, we expect you to start doing RevOps girl walks.
Okay.
No, but yeah, the thing is, I think that especially when it comes to the content in our space, a lot of it can be super dense. Obviously, we start talking about things like data models and data bow ties, and we're throwing out specific books, Winning by Design and Revenue Architecture, and it becomes a lot to digest. Obviously, the longer you're in the space, the more you start to understand all of it. But I think that's where not only do I certainly recommend connecting with us on LinkedIn, following Lizzie with your RevOps Girl Walks and other thought leaders in the space. But if you're a HubSpot admin and you find yourself oftentimes building stuff and then it's maybe executives aren't looking at it, go ahead and join the Sprocketeer community. It's a totally free group. We're all on Slack. It's the largest independent community of HubSpot admin. And we've got a little over 2,000 members in there, totally free to join. And everyone's just helping one another with HubSpot. But the cool thing is that you can ask about these type of questions and you can get insight into these types of things in Sprocketeer. And it's just a great way to have peers supporting one another. So it's a really wonderful place to be. I do also recommend checking out Hugs. We've got our friends Kyle Jepson, Deanna Gloff. They host the HubSpot admin, HubSpot user group on Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Central Time. So make sure you check that out. Mark, always a pleasure when we get to do these live on LinkedIn. And Lizzie, thank you so much for joining us for the Sprocket Pod today.
My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the SprocketPod podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode with your co-hosts, Cameron Collins and Mark Lerner. Be sure to catch us live every week on LinkedIn, and don't forget to subscribe to our episodes on YouTube and Spotify. If you found this episode valuable, please leave a review and share it with others looking to get more from HubSpot. Until next time, keep driving success with your CRM, and as always, Sprocket on.